The other thing I think we need to question is the presumption that same-sex activity is inherently sinful, right? Because that is another underlying assumption in the framework that we currently have for the discussion.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. Assalamu alaikum.
We are having an unusual and therefore very special application to my series format, Friends Along the Way, and it will be with Dr. Aisha Musa. Dr. Aisha holds a PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at Harvard University. Her research and teaching interests include Hadith and Sunnah, translation of classical Arabic texts, Quranic interpretation, women's issues, Islamic law, and modern-day reformist and neo-traditionalist movements. Her publications include Hadith as Scripture, discussions on the authority of the prophetic traditions in Islam, Hadith studies in the Bloomsbury Companion to Islamic Studies. I can't wait to jump in and tell you that I've known Dr. Aisha since she was a student. I'm always so pleased that my life has allowed me to meet, amazing scholars when they were in the process of unfolding their scholarly acumen. However, I'm not supposed to be talking now. I'm supposed to give it over to Dr. Aisha, just to let you know that this particular platform is going to be used to introduce a specific conversation with regard to Hadith and sexual diversity. And so we won't just have her talk about her journey. We'll talk about something specific. And then when I come back in, I will also not linger in the how I know her and love her part. I will simply ask one of the questions that came to my mind when I looked over this wonderful information she will be sharing with you. And then we will take it from there. It will be open to the gallery before we close, I hope. Okay, Dr. Aisha, you have the floor.
Assalamu alaikum. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I'll tell you at the beginning that there is a video of this presentation on the KISS website. What I'm going to be sharing with you is the slides that I turned into that video. And this started out actually as the first step in a project on sex and sexuality and sexual diversity in Islamic thought and practice that Dr. Wadood and I worked on in, I think it was 2017, we had a conference. And so this is the basic, first step of what I started there looking at. Let me get ready to share my screen. Let's see. And so the topic of this is sex and sexuality in early Hadith literature. And I want to start with the framing discussion of this topic, because it shows us the mentality where contemporary Muslim academic scholars tend to be at this point in time. And so I want to start with a couple of quotes. One from Keisha Ali's Sexual Ethics in Islam. She has several things. There's two quotes and one has a breakdown. She says, quote, "The desire on the part of some self-identified gay and lesbian Muslims to have exclusive and publicly recognized same-sex relationships and to do so in a way that falls within an Islamic framework is without precedent in Muslim history." And she further says, quote, "Their desire to have sexual relationships that break conventional Islamic rules," and the underlining here is mine, "but that aspire to the highest standards of Muslim ethics as they understand them, exist in tension with vital theological and juridical principles, aside from those forbidding illicit sex," end quote. And she highlights two particular principles in this regard. And again, the emphasis here with underlining is mine. One should not expose sinful behavior, whether one's own or someone else's, and denying certain rules is a greater offense than breaking them. So that is, and this book is from 2006, so it's the 21st century work. And then Khalid al-Ruwayyib's Before Homosexuality in the Arabo-Islamic World says, quote, "There was simply no native concept that was applicable to all and only those men who were sexually attracted to members of their own sex, rather than women." So this is the mentality that frames the discussions in the contemporary period of sexuality. And I think that there are key issues that we need to really pull out and discuss. One is the tension between, quote, conventional Islamic rules, end quote, and quote, the highest standards of Muslim ethics, end quote. So if there is a tension between the rules and the highest standards of ethics, then we really need to begin to look at the rules and how they came to be what they are. The other thing I think we need to question is the presumption that same-sex activity is inherently sinful, right? Because that is another underlying assumption in the framework that we currently have for the discussion. And also thinking about what is said to be without precedent, the idea of exclusive publicly recognized same-sex relationships and the concept of exclusive same-sex attraction. So these are new ideas that scholars of the past weren't dealing with, at least not that we know of. I'm not entirely convinced that they might not have discussed these things in the past, because my own work in the classical sources and the sources in, say, the first 500 years after the time of the Prophet Muhammad shows me that people were discussing a lot of things that might surprise Muslims today. So these are key issues that I think we need to keep in mind and questions we need to begin to ask. And the idea of conventional rules and the highest standards of Muslim ethics require us to go back to the sources, because both conventional rules and ethics are derived. They're derived from the Quran and the Sunnah, and derivation is a human activity. We might not like to admit it. We might like to think that the rules that, as we understand them, are the rules that God gave us. But derivation is always a human activity that requires deliberation and understanding. And the Sunnah is seen as complementary to the Quran. That is, at least, it's not superior to the Quran, but it's complementary to it. And it's seen as providing a practical example for people to emulate. The other thing that we need to be aware of in this discussion is the concept of ijma', because ijma' is the consensus of scholarly opinion, and it's one of the 4 classically recognized Sunni sources of law. Of course, scholars have been questioning ijma' since at least the time of Shafi'i, who's ijma' and who counts as a scholar. But ijma' is one of those things that we're dealing with when we talk about issues of sexuality and what's recognized as normative, etc. And one of the bases for the presumption that same-sex activity is inherently forbidden and sinful is this consensus of the scholars. And that is, in fact, the reason I put this particular aspect in the discussion. This was not in the original presentation I gave in 2017, was because at one of our book club meetings, one of the participants mentioned a video that was done by the Yaqeen Institute recently on LGBTQ issues. And I watched about the first 10 minutes of it because I really wanted to see what their rationale was. And they began with the premise, the undisputed premise, that same-sex activity is inherently sinful and forbidden. And so that becomes the baseline on which they advise community members on how to deal with the youth and people in the community that are questioning their sexuality. And they cite directly the ijma' of scholars. So I thought it was important to add this too. So we're dealing with the mindset that is, we've inherited this, and this is what everybody agrees on. And I'm hoping that we can begin to question the bases of that kind of agreement for ourselves. Because what I want us to acknowledge about ijma' is that it is a consensus of opinions, and opinions form interpretation. And interpretation is always formed and informed by the lived experiences of the interpreters. And as a source of normative rules, ijma' normalizes the lived experiences of those whom the community has granted scholarly authority. And especially if we're talking about the great scholars of the past, which Muslims like to do. We like to quote the great scholars of the past. We like to follow the great scholars of the past. But they were people of their time. And if they could not imagine, as scholar Al-Ruayb says, if there was no idea in their mind of exclusive same-sex attraction or any thought about publicly recognized exclusive same-sex relationships, then how can we say they were against that. How can we say that's what they were talking about if they didn't even conceptualize it? So we need to really think about the level of human discernment that's going on, the level of human understanding that informs the conventional rules. And again, if there's that disconnect between the highest ethics and the conventional rules, then it's the conventional rules that I would argue need to be re-examined in light of the highest principles. And then the next thing I wanted to look at is the Hadith and Sunnah. This is my area of specialization. And these are the Hadith collections that are considered today to be the Sunni canon. Now you'll see that there are more than 6 books here, even though Muslims traditionally talk about the 6 books. And this list of books is what you find on contemporary Muslim websites as the canonical Hadith collections. Even though the Muwatta of Malik has always traditionally been considered a book of fiqh, that is Islamic legal derivation, because it contains Hadith, it's now included in, and has been for a couple of decades now, because before there were websites, when they started to digitize these things, Harf Technologies and Saqar Software produced a program called Mawsulat al-Hadith al-Sharif, the encyclopedia of the Noble Hadith, and it included all 9 of these works. And so if you look at the Hadith websites, which I've given a couple here, these are the collections that you will find there. So this even shows us that there's kind of a shift in the canon, right? The 6 books become the 9 books. So there's still human interaction with the texts and the way the texts are viewed and presented. But these are the texts, and they are available at the first one. The Sunni canon is an all Arabic language website, hadith.islam-bb.com. And English translations are available at sunnah.com. And those are current websites. I've checked them within the last couple of days. They're still up because websites come and go. But these are the collections that you find commonly. Additional texts that I have looked at in relation to the Hadith about the people of Lot are the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq, which comes to us in the redaction or the edition of Ibn Hisham, the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba, the Musannaf of Abdul Razak, and Mushkil al-Athar of Al-Tahawi. These are other texts outside the Hadith canon that contain these same reports that I was looking at about the people of Lot. And the text I'm focusing on the method. For those of you who know this already, forgive me if I get basic. A method is the textual content of the Hadith. That is the specific thing that the prophet is reported to have said or done. There may be other text and context giving information around it, but there is something that is attributed to the prophet. That is called the method. And so the methods that I'll be talking about appear in these texts as well. So what do the Hadith say about sex? I wanted to start with kind of the basics. And what we find in the Sahih Muslim book of Zakat, that every good is a charity, or every good deed is a charity. And this translation is taken from, I believe, Sunnah.com. It is reported on the authority of Abu Dhar that some of the Prophet's companions said to him, "Messenger of God, the rich take all the rewards. They pray as we pray, they fast as we fast, and they give charity from their excess wealth." He said, "Hasn't God provided you that from which you may also give charity? Certainly, in every glorification of him is charity, in every magnification of him in charity, in every praise of him is charity, every declaration of his oneness is charity, every command of the good is charity, every prohibition of the wrong is charity, and in your sexual intercourse is charity." They said, "Messenger of God, if one of us fulfills his sexual desire, is there a reward for him in it?" He said, "Do you think that if he does it unlawfully, he bears the burden of it? Likewise, if he does it lawfully, he has a reward for it." And this report also is found in the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So this is one of the 2, Sahih Muslim is one of the 2 most respected books. The 2 books that form the center of the Sunni canon are the Sahih Muslim and the Sahih Bukhari. So we see here a positive idea of sexuality. Because one of the things that I think happens in the current discourse is sexuality itself is often viewed in a negative way. And I think that this may partially have to do with some of the contemporary, what are referred to as conservative Christians, although I know Christians who would disagree with them, that sex in itself is somehow bad, sinful, and negative. But the Hadith set out for us in not just the Musnad of Ahmed, but in one of the two Sahihs, one of the most respected and authoritative Hadith collections, that sexuality, if it's lawful, is rewarded, and if it's unlawful, is when it's punished. So the question is that it's lawful, right? Whether it's lawful or whether it's unlawful. And in the Sahih of Bukhari, in his book of conditions, on his section on the conditions of the dowry and the marriage contract, the Prophet was asked, the Prophet said that the conditions that are most worthy of being fulfilled are those which make the private parts lawful to you, right? So there is nothing negative about human sexuality in these hadith. These hadith show that human sexuality is a good thing if it's done lawfully. It's important that the Prophet said the conditions that are most worthy of being fulfilled are those that make the private parts lawful. And we can talk in the future about what constitutes marriage and how that is done. But this again shows that there is not a negativity towards sexuality, towards human sexuality, that it's lawful versus unlawful that is the criterion. And conventional Islamic rules see same-sex activity as categorically unlawful. And this is based on the story of Lot, primarily, which is told in the Quran and interpreted by most Muslims, as it has been by many Christians and Jews, to condemn sexual relations between people of the same gender. And the Sunnah, which we get from the Hadith, because the relationship of Hadith and Sunnah is that the Hadith are the stories that tell us the things the Prophet said and did, and those things that he said and did are the prophetic Sunnah. So the Hadith are the repository of the Sunnah and the vehicle from which we learn about it. So Hadith play a pivotal role. So I'm going to look right now at Amal Qawmin, the act of Lot's people in Hadith. So what does the Hadith say about the act of Lot's people? In Malik's book of punishments, and again, this is not traditionally seen as a Hadith collection, it's traditionally seen as a book of law, but it is the earliest. The reason I start with it is it's the earliest of the 9 books that currently are at these various websites as the Sunni canon. This is the earliest one. And it says, Malik told me that he asked Ibn Shihab about the one who does the act of Lot's people. And Ibn Shihab said he is to be stoned whether he's married or unmarried. So the reason that this is not a hadith, right, is it's not quoting the Prophet. This is Malik saying he asked someone else about it, and this was someone else's opinion. So this is the earliest that we see the mention of the Amal Qawmin, the act of Lot's people. Then, and this is where I think Dr. Wajud had a question that she asked me. These are let me count them, 1, 2, 3, the 3 different methods, the 3 different textual contents that are attributed to the Prophet. These statements are attributed to the Prophet. And I've listed here in this slide the collections in which they occur. One is whomever you find doing the act of Lot's people, kill the active one and the passive one, or kill the one who does it and the one to whom it's done. The second one is what I fear most for my community is the act of Lot's people, and God has cursed whoever does the act of Lot's people. So these are the traditions that use that term, act of Lot's people. They do not specify what that act is. And in the follow-up that I'm doing to this, I deal specifically with the first one and how it's presented in the Hadith collections, because they don't specify what it is, but it's clearly something very negative. And it has possibly the death penalty, but that becomes questionable as we look at more in depth at the Hadith themselves. But these are the things that the Prophet is reported, and I'm not saying whether he said them or not. None of these appear in the 2 Sahih, the Sahih of Muslim or Bukhari. These are not in the 2 Sahih. These are in other collections. And until the modern period, I don't know of any scholar who considered any of them to be of a Sahih grade, which is something we can discuss. They don't sound authentic, the highest grade one can have of Hadith. The act of Lot's people as sexual activity, the idea that it's sexual activity, is made through the Quranic verses in which Lot describes his people as, quote, approaching males lustfully. There are also reports that call a man approaching his wife in the rear, a lutia, a sort of a minor sodomy. So that's where the idea of a sexual connection comes in. The idea that what the people of Lot did is somehow sexual comes from other Hadith reports and the connection with the story of Lot in the Quran. Oops. Sorry. Scholars disagree on the punishment. So this is kind of a little out of order. My further discussion will put this in a different place. Scholars disagree on what the punishment is for the story for whatever this act is, right? Because the prophet is never said to have ordered a specific punishment. The prophet is never reported as having punished anyone himself. And the command to kill those who do the act of Lot's people contradicts the Hadith that says a Muslim's blood may only be spilled for murder, apostasy, and adultery. So there are reasons that scholars traditionally disagree on the punishment for whatever this act happens to be. And we do find, the other thing I put in this video is hints of context, right? There are hints of context in various stories. And the first thing is the Sunan of Adarani, which is, for some people, part of the 6 books, and for others not, on the authority of Amr bin Dinar, indeed you commit lewdness that no one in creation has committed before you, that's the Quranic phrase, means a male never jumped a male until the people of Lot. And so this idea of a male jumping a male, there's an idea of violence here. This is not necessarily two people agreeing on this or having what we would say today is a consensual relationship. So this idea of someone jumping another, this word in Arabic is something like a lion pouncing on its prey. It has negative connotation. And it's nadza in Arabic, meaning saying alaf maksura. And it has this negative connotation of a predator pouncing on prey. And so how does that affect this understanding of the people of Lot? So that Lot's condemnation of his people is understood by this Hadith reporter to mean something that is more predator and prey, and not what Al-Ruwayyah or Ali are talking about when they talk about same-sex exclusive relationships. It wouldn't be a predator-prey relationship. And in the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba, we see this story, an extended story about what happened with Lot's guest. And I've chosen to take just 2 parts out of that to really show more of the context. And this story says his evil old wife, so Lot's wife has a very negative reputation, went to his people and said, tonight, Lot is being visited by the most beautiful and best smelling men I have ever seen. And then, so in response, the people rushed the door and nearly overwhelmed it. So, and when we look at the Quranic story of this, where it says the men of the city came running, right? So there's this idea of a crowd rushing forward. They don't know Lot's guests, right? They have no idea who they are, yet they're rushing to break down the door. And then this is something from the Sirah of Ibn Hisham, or the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq from Ibn Hisham, tells the story of a king named Lahmiya, describes him as an evil man doing what the people of Lot did, right? Doing the Amal Qawm. And he used to send for the young sons of kings and sexually assault them in a room he had made for that purpose so that they couldn't rule after that, right? And today, and historically, Muslims have seen Ibn Ishaq as less than trustworthy, so they quote Ibn Hisham instead. But Tirmidhi, whom I'll discuss in a future video, inshallah, cites Ibn Ishaq as trustworthy, considers him trustworthy. So this, but I'm citing this from Ibn Hisham's edition of Ibn Ishaq's Sirah, but it shows someone doing and a definition of the act of Lot's people. And again, what we see here is sexual assault. and we see it as sexual assault for political purposes. He wants to, and this is an excerpt of a longer story. And in the longer story, it talks about shaming the ruler by assaulting the son of the ruler. So this is, again, something very negative and having absolutely nothing to do with the kind of relationships that people are thinking about now when they're thinking same-sex activity is absolutely and inherently forbidden, and there's no other way to think about it. But when we talk about it from the standpoint of the act of the people of Lot, which the prophet was condemning, when we look further into these stories, these are the hints of context that we see. We see that there is force involved. We see that there's attempted rape in the Quranic story, the men coming running, the men of the city coming running, and we see actual rape mentioned in the story of Lahmiya. And that's the context that we find for Amal Talut, the action of the people of Lot, or what the people of Lot did. And now I'd like to shift gears a little and talk about framework for interpreting, a Quranic hermeneutic for interpreting the Sunnah. And this is something I see as very important because the Quran really is the governing document for Muslims. And in Quran, Surah Al-Anbiya, Ayah 107, Quran 21, 107, it says, Ma arsalnaka illa rahmatan lil alamin. We have only sent you as a mercy to creation, right? This is a very strong statement. A ma'ila statement in Arabic is incredibly strong. The only reason that, and whether you think the ka refers to Muhammad personally or to the Quran as a book, and different people may have different interpretations, whoever that you is, sent only as a rahmah, only as a mercy, a compassion for humanity. And if we take this to mean Muhammad, which the majority of Muslims do, that becomes, in my estimation, I would argue, the overarching framework for interpreting the Sunnah, right? Because if any interpretation of the Sunnah deviates from that or creates something that is other than Rahmah lil Alameen, we need to rethink that interpretation of Sunnah and even rethink what's attributed to the Prophet. Because other ayah of the Quran talk about the Prophet being honorable, right? I mean, sure, the Quran shows where he made mistakes and God corrected him. Like when he turned away from the blind man or when he forbade something to please his wives. But God corrected him in those things, right? So when we look at things that people later said about the Prophet, and I'm not saying we're going to say these people are liars, although when you study Hadith, some of the greatest Hadith rejectors of all time were the people who compiled the Sahih Bukhari and the Sahih Muslim. They rejected a lot more Hadith than they actually put in their collections because they took these things very seriously. And I'm asking us to take it equally seriously and use this as the hermeneutic for interpreting the Sunnah. And in fact, also as the critical, overarching, when we look at something that somebody said the Prophet said or did say, based on what I know about the Prophet from the Quran, do I believe this? Because even if a person believed it, you don't have to consider somebody a liar when they reported something they heard from somebody else. All it means is they believed that story. And I'm going to try and take responsibility for my own belief based on what I understand of the Quranic hermeneutic. And this, again, in the framework of Quranic hermeneutic, people say to me, I was asked just yesterday in the book club meeting, how do we reconcile the differences of our understanding and that of the people of the past? And this is the verse, these are the two verses that come to my mind. This one, it's the same ayah, it's repeated twice. That is a community that's passed away. They have what they earned and you have what you earned. You will not be asked about what they used to do. Like, we are not responsible for the opinions of the people of the past. In my view, we can read them, we can learn from them, we can think about them, but we are responsible, right? We are the Muslims that are doing this now, today, in our own time, with our own understanding, with the changes of understanding of humanity that have happened over the centuries. And we are responsible for what we do, and we'll have what we earn. And we won't be asked about what they used to do. The Quran is very explicit in it. And so what I'm calling for is reframing the discussion, because as I see it, This is not about gay and lesbian Muslims trying to reconcile competing identities or make Islam palatable to the West. It's about assuming our responsibility for approaching the Quran and Sunnah and seeking to derive rules from them that aspire to the highest standards of Muslim ethics. And that is the end of this presentation. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. There is a lot to unpack, and I don't know if we'll get all of it in the course of the 1 hour that we have allotted. I do want to ask those of you who want to jump into the discussion, think about what it is you would like, excuse me, you would like to ask, so that we can get to it straight away after. Let's just close this up because actually visually I keep seeing your screen and not yourself. Okay. This is, I think, a very succinct but very powerful presentation of a number of features with regard to how we understand what we consider to be the classical discussions on the matters of sexual diversity. Are you going to close that, Sayan?
Do you want me to stop sharing?
Please. Thank you. I had a specific question when I looked over this from Dr. Aisha before, which I'm going to get to, but before I do that, I just want to remind us that in building our, sort of current lived reality within the framework of Islam, we are standing on the shoulders of, 1,444 years of tradition. Happy New Year, by the way. We don't just jump away from these traditions. Instead, and this is part of the gifts of Islamic feminism, actually, and reformist Islam altogether, but I still think Islamic feminism did best. Wink, wink. Instead, we engage that same intellectual corpus, as well as what are the primary sources. We engage them from the framework of one of the things that Dr. Aisha said near the end, and that is that we are not accountable for concepts, interpretations, and even applications of previous generations. We are responsible for our generation, and our generation has certain benefits, which in my estimation are benefits that are inherent in the way in which Allah created us. And one of those aspects of our creation is the pursuit of knowledge. And the more that we know, the more our concepts will expand. And on the basis of those concepts, when we revisit the principles and the specifics of previous generations' discourses, we may agree with them and we may disagree with them, but we also provide our illah, our reasoning. And so, one of the beauties of Dr. Aisha's work in all of the ways that I've known her, and again, she was a student when, I was at Harvard, but also I was on a committee evaluating her intellectual work. So I had to read everything. And she is an amazing scholar, and she continues to learn and she continues to share from her learning. So, thank you, Dr. Aisha. We're very privileged to have you, especially in this area. I just want to say tongue in cheek, but I can't say for very long. There was another student I had teaching a hermeneutics course here 12 years ago, who Dr. Faqih here in Indonesia, who wrote the book Mubadila, which is a methodology of interpreting Hadith on the basis of Mubadila, an exchange, rather than from a view of gender hierarchy. So again, we continue to engage in a conversation with regard to our traditions and our sources, but we do this in a manner that expresses this gift that Allah has given us, and that is our capacity to increase in knowledge. So I want to just bring up a reminder really quickly before I ask two questions. One is that in this Hadith sharing, so this discussion of Hadith that's being shared, you're being gifted a very comprehensive understanding of a very complex matter that has expanded and contracted and expanded and contracted all across Muslim history. And I urge you to go back and look at this again and to take your time with regard to some of the particular points, because raising the idea that the Quran and the Hadith/Sunnah are our two primary sources talks very specifically about everything that stems from that then is a conversation of communities. Now, because we live, let's face it, in a time where the most conservative interpretation of the matters of sex and sexuality is promoted as the only interpretation, we have that knowledge pursuit as our goal, and that obviously is the motivation behind KISS. We need to reintegrate the studies of sexuality into our studies of Islam, and understanding that those contributions are ongoing, and we contribute, from our location. So we still engage the Quran and the Hadith, but we engage it with certain matters that in our understanding has changed. And if, I might say some of them have progressed, and that is that sexuality is as significant to a person as spirituality. Now we have a hint of that when the Prophet, upon him be peace, says, you get a reward for doing it, in a licit manner. So this comes to my first question, and something that I'm hoping to pursue between now and 2023 with hopefully a conference. And that is the idea of sin, and that a sin should be punished, the absence of a sin should be rewarded. The main word for sin with regard to sexual relations is the word zina. This is a fascinating topic in and of itself, and I'm not going to sidetrack us into having the conversation, because I do want Dr. Aisha to answer the question that she and I discussed before. But one of the things that you need to understand is that the understanding of zina has evolved throughout that 1444 years, and our understanding of it today has not been located. We simply pretend that we all agree to something, and I think we need to interrogate it. Why? Because there was no notion of the idea of consensual. Consensual did not even exist in marriage. So a man's right to a woman's genitalia was with almost no condition. One of the conditions would be the blood flow after pregnancy and the blood flow during menstruation. That comes out as almost the only condition. A woman was even denied the right to fast, just in case her husband wanted to have sex. So understanding the notion of consensus as we have evolved it also as a legal term is going to be an important conversation when we start talking about what constitutes zina or sin in the context of sexuality. You can comment on that if you want, but I don't want us to get sidetracked. The other thing I just want to say is that in the hadith that you quoted using the term jumping, which you from Nazat, this is not the Quranic term. The Quranic term is ata, which literally means come. But also, as these two terms were concluded, they were both used in the context of anal sex, which, by the way, in the jurisprudence was considered with regard to anal sex with a man's female spouse, as well as anal sex with another man. So the discussion about anal sex took on both dimensions with different levels of agreement and disagreement, by the way, from the different schools. But also it comes to mind because all of the terms that were developed from the word of the name of the prophet Lut, upon him be peace, all of the words that were derived, they were all derived, and they also evolved even in the first few hundred years of discussion. So terms like liwat and luti or luti asugra, all of these are derived terms, and they can be unpacked. So the one thing that is that Dr. Aisha is careful to repeat on more than one occasion is the act of the people of Lut, the act of Qawm Lut, which people then say is liwat, and then people say liwat means homosexuality or whatever. But the Quranic reference to that act, as we have seen looking at, for example, Dr. Scott Kugel's work and other scholars like Imam Musa here on Friends Along the Way, that act was a coercive act, and it involved not only anal rape, but it also involved barring the path from people who were trying to seek refuge during a time when, if you're a traveler, you can't just go to the corner store and buy yourself a bottle of Coca-Cola and a bag of chips so you can keep going on your journey. You needed the hospitality of people in order to do that. And so this is much more important than we seem to understand from our current location. So my question to Dr. Aisha had been, on the basis of my study through the Hadith leader, and that is that there are no sahih or sound Hadith on the authority of the Prophet on this topic at all. And her response to that is?
Yeah, not that I know of. All of the Hadith that mention Amal Qawm Lut are not in the two Sahihs of Bukhari and Muslim. And until Al-Albani was a 20th century scholar, and on the website sunnah.com does list one of those as Sahih, but it says it's Al-Albani. And of course, I haven't studied Al-Albani's work. He passed away in the latter part of the 20th century. But I know of no classical scholars who consider any of the mutun that I listed as Sahih. being the highest grade of Hadith. Tirmidhi considers it Hassan, but Hassan for Tirmidhi was quite broad. For Tirmidhi, Hassan just meant nobody in the chain of narrators was accused of falsehood. Doesn't mean they weren't accused of bad memory. So this is another thing that people don't realize about the classical grading of Hadith. A, scholars disagreed on it. B, Hassan, just because the Arabic word means good, doesn't mean it's a sound Hadith that deserves to be used in law, especially not for something that would impose the death penalty. But until the 20th century, I know of no scholar who has declared any of the textual content that I talked about today as Sahih.
Yeah, so that means that, we don't have what we would consider along the lines of the sciences of Hadith that we have developed in our tradition. We don't have a single statement of the Prophet with regard to this, upon him be peace. That's a very powerful thing. But because the jurisprudence or the fiqh is developed from the Quran and somewhat, from Sunnah and Hadith, obviously the variants that they also identify, that puts us in the place where, as we say, we're in need of new ijtihad. We're in need of new ways to be able to understand how do we take very, very, very limited sources and build on it to a total understanding, of these sacred sources to our current reality. I think it's very easy to see that the principle that Dr. Aisha offered to us with regard to how we even understand the role of the Prophet, upon him be peace, is وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاهُ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. We have not sent this person except as a mercy to all the worlds. So we must interpret the contributions with that principle of mercy in mind. Now I want to open up to anyone who might have a question. We only have about 7 or 8 minutes, to be fair to Dr. Aisha, has given us way more than that since she turned in early, but also because I try to keep these succinct. If you want to raise your virtual hand, the screen will indicate to me that you're doing that, and I can notify you that you can unmute your mic. If you want to put something into the chat to respect your own level of anonymity with regard to this thing, which will be made public, you may do that. The other thing I think that we are, again, so privileged to have Dr. Aisha with, is that in her study of Hadith, prior to her investigation with this particular issue as well, she was already, quite versed in all the aspects of the nuance of even how we understand Hadith. And she has given you that. I mean, you have the list of all those collections at the beginning of her presentation, and links that you can go and look at them in terms of the modern technology. So, it's such a wonderful gift. And then she accepted an invitation to, address this issue further for the conference that we had in 2017. And that was 5 years ago, and she's still building on it. So any questions that you have of any type, and don't be shy to ask a question that sounds like, you're a PhD student or anything like that. Ask from your heart, because Dr. Aisha is, just such a lovely friend of mine and such a heart-filled person. So you don't have to worry or be intimidated by her brilliance, although it is intimidating. Please, if you have any questions, let us know. Dr. Aisha, you want to?
Yeah, I'm not afraid of any question, and you might give me an idea. I haven't thought of looking into the word zina. That's something I need to add to my studies for that, because the amal qallut is punished like zina for some scholars. So what does that even mean? So there's no such thing as a stupid question. If you're a beginner and you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm happy to answer your question. If you have more knowledge and you really want to drill into something, if I've looked at it before, I will be happy to answer it. If I haven't, I'd be happy to go and look into it.
Someone has asked, when will you discuss about marriage? This is another can of worms. Oh my goodness.
I have actually in the pipeline, the outgrowth of this presentation that you saw today was the first step, right? I have written, it has grown into a book chapter entitled Sexuality, Marriage, and the People of Lot. And that is currently under contract with Duke University Press. Omid Safi and Scott Kugel are the editors of the volume. I am not sure the exact title that the volume is going to have. It's something along the lines of Sex and Sexuality in Islamic Thought and Praxis. I don't know the exact volume title because it is still in the pipeline. But I did send my final revised version of the chapter to Professor Kugel back in January. and I'm waiting to hear on that. So that is work that I have been doing, and I am planning a presentation similar to this one on that, on specifically the topic of marriage. But I have not finished that yet, but the chapter is on its way, God willing.
Yeah, we're working on this marriage question. The most recent publication from Musa is towards Adl and Ihsan, that is justice and good character and behavior ihsan in marriage, which helps to unpack, even though it is still specifically addressing the binary marriage, it is deconstructing the idea of marriage as an institution of hegemony. So there is work that is going on, and here in Indonesia, they're working on the term consensus, which is fascinating. So we are building a corpus of material in these times. And the point is simply to, sort of revert back to my first statement, and that is that sexuality and spirituality are two very important aspects of the human construct. And the idea, as we know, that sexuality is only within the binary of heterosexual attraction is an idea that our knowledge as humans have shown to be limited. And therefore, the question of how we engage with it in the context of understanding our intellectual legacy as Muslims, that's the work that, is ongoing now. Well, I just want to thank Dr. Aisha again. I love you, really. I just love your scholarship. I'm not supposed to emote in the process of doing something like this, but I'm just so excited. And thank you so much for such a short notice to turn around and share this with us.
Yeah.
Looking forward to another opportunity.
I just see so much need for it when I see the limitations of the mindset and framework of the current discourse. That really, I see that there's so much that went on in the past that was human and derived, and we Muslims seem to have a very narrow view of it now. And I think it's such a blessing to be able to access the sources, and to ask people to look at the sources again. And as a final thought, I'd like to say, I'm not saying we have to say the people of the past were wrong. We don't have to accuse them of being impious. We can say they were doing the best they can to understand what Allah has given us in their own time, in their own way. And we can learn from them without necessarily agreeing with everything they said. And that we don't have to disrespect them in any way when we do that.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, if you look across history, because I specifically designated only the first 500 years in my research, if you look across history, they already disagreed with each other. They already had variance of opinion. And the idea that we should hold only to the most conservative, patriarchal, hegemonic, homophobic, interpretation, that is doing a disservice to our capacity, as living and breathing Muslims.
The other thing that I think we need to keep in mind is the broader discourse outside of Muslim communities is very similar. The hostility toward same-sex marriage and transgender that permeates U.S. politics today on the conservative side, really the Muslim discourse in the U.S. really tends to mirror that. So we also need to ask, how much are people today, people of their time, in that were influenced by the broader discourse, rather than going back to the history and what Muslims were discussing, the emotion that's wrapped up, especially here in the US, with the whole idea of same-sex marriage and transgender individuals, influences the way Muslims in the United States are discussing it. And I would assume that that's the same everywhere, that there's some kind of broader political, socio-cultural mindset that's influencing it.
Wow, amazing. Thank you all in the gallery for your attendance. Thank you again, Dr. Aisha. And I hope to see you all soon for other events.
And people can always ask a question through this website.
Yeah.
Or my website is draymusa.com, just draymusa.com. You can shoot me questions there. And I'm happy to answer questions if I've looked into it. If I haven't looked into it yet, you may be giving me a lead for another, rabbit hole to jump down.
Why not?
But I have high-speed internet and library access, so I'm good.
Indeed. Okay. Thank you again. Salams all. Goodbye.
Assalamu alaikum.